And again, it cut off. I'm sorry, but I'm going to get back to this. I'm just briefly talk about the election of 1840. The Whigs succeed. Basically, the bottom line is the Whigs are actually going to kind of become competitive with the Democratic Party, and they're going to elect their man, a fellow by the name you guys have heard of, William Henry Harrison. Of course, he was the great Indian fighter. Anyway, he is going to become elected president, a war hero from 1812. Pretty easy deal. He's going to be elected president. One of the reasons why he's elected president, he will defeat, by the way, our buddy Martin Van Buren. One of the reasons why he was able to become president is because he also added this fellow to the ticket. This guy here is John Tyler. John Tyler was he didn't much care for Andrew Jackson. He becomes a Whig mostly because of that, but he was still largely a Democrat in his belief system. Unfortunately for the Whigs, there's a good news, bad news element. See, William Henry Harrison was an older gentleman at this point, and he wanted to demonstrate how healthy and virile he was. So on his inauguration day, he gave his speech, one of the longest speeches, I believe the longest speech, inaugural speech in American history. It was a cold, windy day. To show how vital and virile he was, he gives his speech with his jacket open, and attributed to this, he later gets pneumonia. He may have gotten pneumonia anyway, regardless of the open jacket. But this is the story. Either way, regardless of the open jacket and how he got the pneumonia killed him. He's the first president to die in office, and that means that John Tyler will become president. And though he was a Whig, he still followed largely Democratic principles. Either way, that is the setup of the second party system. But we also have some other things going on politically in the United States at this time. There were a lot of different groups that were starting to make a political voice. I want to go through them relatively quickly here. So labor unions. Labor unions are when workers get together and they work collectively toward their own best interest. If you go to your boss and you want to negotiate wages, if you're on your own, the boss can pay you whatever he wants. But if everybody comes together and says, "Hey, we want these wages," then that puts the employer on kind of a spot. He almost has to negotiate with you, or he has to fight you. The concerns of these labor unions, they wanted to have better working conditions, they wanted to have better pay, but in a larger spectrum, they were also very concerned with economic justice and economic fairness. So the chief tool that these groups used was the strike. In other words, if you do not give us what we want, we are not going to work for you. If we do not work for you, the work does not get done, you don't make any money. That was the chief tool. The goal was to force the owners to negotiate. Didn't always work out very well. In fact, quite often it ended in violence. These are just some examples of some of the major labor unions. Many of them were craft unions and skilled labor work unions. A lot of these crafts and skilled labor, as we've seen earlier, are taking a hit because of manufacturing, replacing skilled labor with unskilled labor. This is a secondary source, and as you know, a secondary source is one that is written after the fact. It is an analysis of primary sources. In this case, it was from one of my favorites, historian Howard Zinn, in his famous People's History of the United States. I wanted to go over a couple elements in this, so you can read this to yourself. I don't need to read it to you, because that would just take too much time, but I want you to notice a couple things. Right off the bat, he says, during those years, he's talking about the trade unions, and one of the things that he does is he lets you know what he's doing here is he's citing his source for this particular bit of information. This is a good idea, and if you're reading histories, it's always a good idea if that historian is telling you what the source is. So the reason why I want you to look at this is I want you to get an idea of how historians kind of make their case. Another thing that you'll notice here too, he tells you he's basically telling you that these unions were not officially recognized. In fact, they were looked at as being relatively dangerous and even, treasonous. And to show this, to prove this, he gives you a direct quote. So he actually gives you a couple direct quotes. There's a direct quote right here, and then of course he extends the direct quote later. Where does he pick up that quote? Here it is. So these areas here, this is a direct quote. So he's using the actual words he's using a primary source to support his position. And this is exactly what you guys are going to be doing with your essays. It's good to make a claim. Of course, this here is Zinn's claim, his general idea, and he's supporting this idea with specific historical facts, this direct quote from this judge, and he's also citing other sources. All right, this is an important skill for the historian. We also had other movements, social reform movements, and the basic beliefs of these social movements, is that society could be improved by making personal improvements. If we can improve the morals of the individuals in society, then society itself would improve. They understood that the reality was that many of the problems that were being faced in this new society were a little bit too big for just churches to fix and using charity to fix. No, you need to have a larger answer to some of these questions. They also believed that that people were by nature good, that people were perfectible. And oftentimes these social reform movements believed that they had the one true answer to all of our society's problems. This is called a dogma. Some examples of these social movements is the public education movement. Here we are, yay, we're all in public school. Thank you, Horace Mann. Right? He is one of the chief proponents of a public school system. The idea that everybody should have access to an education, not just those people who can afford to send their children to school. The idea that one of the functions of the state should be to provide for education. Mostly starting off with primary school education, later on being extended to secondary schools. And this movement is going to catch. It's going to spread throughout the country, and ultimately, here we are. Yeah. Also, we see something called the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance. What in the world does that mean? Well, what that means is there were folks out there who were saying, the big problem with America right now is all the drunks. All the people drinking, and there was a lot of drinking going on. This was an age of alcohol. Much, much worse than it is today. And these were folks who said, what we need to do is we need to just ban alcohol. If we can ban alcohol, everything else will kind of fall into place. And that's what temperance is. It's the banning of either the banning or the refusal to partake in alcohol. So this particular social movement is going to start to arise in the early 19th century. We also had an example with the Female Moral Reform Society, that one of the problems is that too many women are going astray. This was a specific problem with urbanization. As women are moving into these urban areas, they're becoming more dependent upon the economy, and yet they are experiencing lower wages, higher housing costs. So many of them turn to prostitution and turn to other illegal avenues in order to survive and to get by. So the Female Moral Reform Society was exactly what the title indicates. We also had with leader Dorothea Dix. She became a leader in the asylum and penitentiary movements. She noticed that when people were put into, especially people who were mentally sick, were put into asylums, these asylums were just absolute hellholes. They were awful places where these people were just contained and suffered horrible, experiences that only made their mental conditions worse. She also noticed that this was true of prisons. That maybe what we need to do is we need to reform how we handle our asylums and our prisons and make them a little bit better, and then hopefully the people who come out of there will come out better. These are some of our social reform movements. Another major movement that was coming out of this area were the abolitionists. The abolitionists were led largely by free blacks, especially free blacks living in the North. Quakers were a central part of this movement. And also white militants, white militants such as one of my favorites, of course, is William Lloyd Garrison, who was the publisher of an anti-slavery newsletter, and he was just a firebrand. I mean, you can just tell by this quote here: "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And he was, and he got a lot of people angry. He dragged through the streets of Boston in chains. He set fire to a copy of the Constitution. He was a pretty radical guy. These guys who were militantly anti-slavery. And, of course, we have probably one of our more famous of our abolitionists, among other things, Frederick Douglass, the author of A Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass. That was a very influential book in abolitionism. Now, there are a couple of ideas here. For instance, not just because we were anti-slave doesn't necessarily mean we weren't racist or we particularly like black people. For instance, the American Colonization Society was an institution specifically set up to, free slaves, but then get them the heck out of the country. And in fact, eventually they will buy up land in Africa. That land will later on become Liberia. But we also had the Liberty Party, which was the very first political party to run on a platform of anti-slavery. Didn't get very far, but they were there. So we start to see the buildup of this very important movement, and this is going to become really crucial in the very near future. And then finally, women. Women are looking around. They're seeing the expanding influence of universal male suffrage, and they're thinking, well, wait a minute, what about us? We're just as smart as they are, right? So they're going to start to get together. Now, these women are already starting to participate in other reform movements. In fact, women are going to be involved in almost all of these political movements. Labor movements, they were big in the abolitionist movement. They were huge in the temperance movement. I mean, they were major influences in a lot of these different movements. Folks like such as very radical people like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were rabid abolitionists, but also fighting for women's rights, equality. Women, these advocates would get together in Seneca Falls in 1848, what becomes known as the Seneca Falls Convention, and they were going to pass a Declaration of Sentiments and Rights. And what they did here was they actually just kind of rewrote the Declaration of Independence and included women and included some of the grievances that women have against men and have against a society that discriminates against them. It was really rather brilliant work of literature there. But the idea of course, the one thing that these girls were focusing on is, suffrage. We want to be able to vote, right? So women are going to become a huge impact, or going to start to become a huge impact in the political process. So that's it. This is all I really want to talk about at this point. There's a lot of other influences going on, but I really wanted to emphasize the political under this, and we can talk about some of the other ones later on. So have a good one.